I'll just say a couple of words about science. I think science works exactly the same way. I mean, a lot of technological science that is aiming to produce things that are going to have an impact on the market, and therefore they have to be reproducible in a pretty exact way, are attempting to, I think, put a concept of anthropomorphic or human knowledge on the materials that they've got and control what is going to happen to those materials. That is science that is very often generated on the back of scientists who are simply trying to engage with the materials they've got. So, they might be trying to engage with botanical materials or stones or, I don't know, stars or energy or heat or something. And if they go in there thinking that they know what they're doing and that they can reproduce a result, it's kind of it's not research really. Well, it is research, but it's a very different kind of research. It's almost a contradiction in terms, because how can you engage with something having already told yourself you know what it is, without just attempting to work within those parameters and control it? So you're not going to be releasing anything from the engagement with a material. It's just a kind of control mechanism. And I think some of the really wonderful scientists that there have been and that there are don't know what they're doing a lot of the time. I mean, they've trained for years and years and years and years and years, so it's not based on nothing. They've got to practice. But the practice, a good practice, allows you to quote unquote fail and not come up with something that's reproducible. But this would take us back to what is it that is, if performativity is not knowing, what is it that is not known, or what is the process of not knowing? I think you're trying to get away from the idea that if you knew enough, you'd be able to figure it all out. And not knowing is being able to accept that you will never figure it all out. You can, of course, work out particular engagements with materials that you've got. But again, if you're aiming to just know through that engagement and impose some kind of anthropomorphic structure on the materials that you're working with, then, I mean, sort of, so what? You're just creating something that'll fit in the box. But constantly having to work with something you don't know and you will never know is a very different activity. I think that's what a lot of practices do. A lot of practices are centered around matter, whether that matter be another human body or another person, precisely not a human body, but a person, or whether it's clay, or whether it's words or something, whether it's paint or music or whatever it is, digital materials. A practice, in my opinion, is something that is usually conveyed through generations of people who have tried to engage with that material and understand its materiality. And if you understand the materiality of a matter, then you're understanding some of the points of contact that other people have made. You're drawing on years and years, often centuries, of people working with matter in various different particular ways, depending upon their socio-historical context and their socio-situated context. that may or may not work for you. But you're kind of going in there with the approach that you can't dominate that material, you don't have authority over the material, you can't control them. I think there's something that that makes performance, no matter what material you're using, whether you're a scientist or whatever you are, a dancer or whatever you are, there's the energy that comes in performance comes from something happening that is not controlled by the performer. The practitioner, if they've got a really good practice, they can get into a space. Space is the wrong word. They can get into an engagement with the material where their self disappears. Their self just becomes part of a kind of morphological ecology with the material that they are. Before they lost the self, they thought they were working with. And when they come out of that differentiation, when they come out of that kind of undifferentiation, when they come out of that ecology, necessarily they're different because they've been part of an ecology, and ecologies by definition change all the time, right? So if you've been part of that, then you come out of it and you're changed from what you were before, got a different kind of self. And I think one of the things of seeing live artists that's quite exciting is you watch that change happening in front of you. But any art maker is often changing with the material that they're working with. And then what everybody else is aware of usually is how they express that, or how they manage to presence that change for other people. And what they're presencing is a change, but they don't necessarily know anything about the material that they've engaged with. If they did know about it, they wouldn't change. They would just be working on the grounds that they already know. Performance has a number of different valences. I mean, it could be a public performance in any way whatsoever. I mean, it could be a public performance in the way that, say, Cara Novella works. She works in small communities of people, and basically they're performing for the community, and they're all performing, so there isn't like an audience and a community. And I think that a performance is usually, as you indicate, Adamo, a kind of represencing of the change that the people who've been working with the material have experienced or have gone through. And sometimes that represencing is a representation, which means, in terms of cultural studies vocabulary, a representation is something that fits inside discourse and can be understood by the people who are in the discursive ideology. Represencing is slightly different. In represencing, you're kind of offering the material, you're offering material to the audience, whatever that is, to go through that whole process of losing self, or loosing self, and also gathering self back into something that is that can be presenced. And that's I think what that is what I think of as performativity in a performance. If you don't have some element of performativity in a performance, some sense of something is happening right now to you somatically, because you're part of a change that is going on, then the whole thing just becomes really boring. I mean, it doesn't become boring in a useful way. It becomes commodified. It just becomes objectified. It becomes represented. And that's not what people, a really crude thing. You don't pay large sums of money to go to see or listen to a concert or something like that, and just sit there and watch something that you already know. You want to have something that is happening to you. So even something like, the McDonald's version of, a musical, there needs to be something that is happening, as well as the presentation or the representation of all these structures that you already know generically. And I used to think that actors in musicals were dreadful because they were always reproducing and representing things that we already know. But now I think they're absolutely amazing, because even though the structure that they work in is not supposed to produce anything new, and that's why you can pay to go see exactly the same production of Les Miserables in Tokyo as you do in Paris, as you do in New York, because you're getting the same thing. The only reason you go back is because it's not the same. And the only reason that that it's going to be different is because something is happening to that actor. And you're part of it, you're witnessing it. There's a whole literature on witnessing, which I haven't really brought to this discussion ever, but I used to be very interested in. About, witnessing is often a somatic feeling. It's a feminist concept that comes from the 80s and 90s, about a somatic feeling that you get when you don't know something, but you witness that something has happened. And the only way you can register that is by feeling that you've changed. You've changed. I mean, there's this kind of weird thing called The first step for me is to split between the individual, which is something that discourse defines, and the self. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I separate between the sociocultural and the socio-situated. Now, a lot of people have problems with the word self because they think it means the same thing as individual, and they use other words instead. Oh, there's lots of different words that people use instead of self. I'm just using it as a kind of indication of something that is moving towards the loss of a discursive identity, or a putting aside of a discursive identity. And I think that, a lot of people, I mean, again, something that comes out of 20th century Western philosophy is a sense of crisis being very important, because suddenly we all knew about crises happening all over the world because of the way that media worked in the 20th century. And crisis is one of the places where self tends to emerge or be given more weight. And most people have, several crises in their life, but not all the time, because it'd be really difficult to live that way. But I think art makers have structures of practice that allow them or encourage them or train them or something to get into that state where the individual is really not that important anymore. Or it never goes away, but it's not what you're focusing on. I mean, I don't like to use these words because I don't really know enough about them, because I've consciously and self-consciously always ignored them. This is going to sound actually tautological because I just said self-consciously, but it could be, words like ego. I don't use that word, but a lot of people do. And what they mean very often by ego is what is recognized by discourse. And it is the thing that discourse doesn't allow to emerge. What I'm trying to do with self is it's nothing to do with what discourse recognizes or doesn't want. It's something else. It's something that is somatically experienced by people. Very often art makers are trained to do this all the time, but it takes a lot out of you, because you've got to lose yourself completely. You've got to get rid of all that notion of I exist as a thing, to morph into a continuum of a material ecology. And then you've got to gather yourself back in again and figure out, usually represencing what has happened is the core of the energy that an art maker is, in a sense, attempting to harness and direct. But it's not to do with ego and id. It's more to do with something that happens when you've moved away from the individual. You've moved away from even the kind of self that is asked for, or the positionality that is asked for in a situated world, into something that is even more somatically flexible, I guess. So not knowing, it's predicated on not knowing self, right? Not knowing isn't just something that you do to matter. It's something that you do to this matter. I mean, we couldn't function within the ideological worlds that exist currently, or have ever existed, if we didn't have ideological identities. In other words, individual, kind of representations within them, although that works very, very differently in different political systems in different socio-historical time. I've done two recent books. One of them is a politics practice, and the other one is on early modern, what gets left out of the early modern individuality and self-citizen, what gets left out. And what's really interesting for me about looking at that particular period is that you can see really clearly what is left out, because you can see it being shoved aside and pushed somewhere else. But it did exist before. Whereas now, when we think of individuality within a particular socio-cultural liberal, neoliberal discourse, you don't see that so clearly because it's already been got rid of. But I invented it on the back of 20 or more years of situated work, which was on the back of a lot of 20th century Western philosophy about working class knowledge, that spawned a lot of the vocabulary in the 80s and 90s feminism. It spawned a lot of the vocabulary in the African American philosophies that emerged in the 1980s. It spawned a lot of the vocabularies around Native American stuff in the 1980s and 90s. In other words, it's the situated was always concerned with what wasn't included in discourse, but it had a presence of its own in any of those particular communities. It's able now in African American philosophy to say that a white person cannot understand a Black person because they don't have the same situated and socio-situated growth or experience or relation or relationality with other people and other things. Food is a really good example of that. Food is something that is often not just sociocultural, but very socio-situated. There are certain foods that I really don't like, and that there are other people in different kinds of situated particularities, and they really like them, they value them. The sociocultural tends to be something that is engaged continually with the representations of the discourse or the ideology in which you exist. It very often challenges it. It's very interested, the sociocultural is often very interested in power and who doesn't have power and how to get power for them and how that power differential has been set up. And I mean, a lot of cultural studies is about that. The socio-situated, it is, of course, interested in a certain kind of power. If you think that a lot of people in socio-situated places which are excluded from discourse are also excluded from various areas of what we might call now social justice. The old term for this kind of stuff was agency, yeah? And yet it doesn't mean that they don't have their own social world. Just because homeless people don't fit into sociocultural norms doesn't mean that they don't have their own cultures or their own social agreements and values and ways of interacting and relating. And of course, a lot of this for me has come out of the feminist movement from the 60s through the 90s into the 2000s, and watching women completely excluded from X, Y, and Z, drawing huge support, ways of understanding the world from the people around them who are normally other women. Just because they're not recognized doesn't mean that they're not there in a situated way. They may not fit into sociocultural structures of what is representationally valid. Most of us have sociocultural representations that we fit, like I'm a teacher, right? I'm supposed to do certain kinds of things, especially in the UCD environment, right? And there are also a number of sociocultural things that I do that discourse doesn't really agree with, but that it knows is there. And they try to kind of, the whole emergence, for example, of an LGBTQ community is something that is probably coming from the socio-situated, but as it arrives in discourse, it slowly acquires a sociocultural representation and gradually acquires some kind of representational force within the kind of Western governments that I've been mainly focusing on. But the socio-situated, most of us have that as well. It's often with very close friends. It's often in moments of intimacy. It's often with families. who you may not like that much, but you're around all the time, or groups of people who come together because you feel like you're talking to somebody who understands what you're talking about for the first time. So the socio-situated, and I really do think that an awful lot of art makers make art socio-situated environments. If they make them in sociocultural environments, which they also do, they're often doing it because they need to make money, because they need to eat. But very often the interesting thing that they're making their money out of originally or initially comes from something that emerged and in something that happened in a socio-situated world where you don't succeed and fail in that way. You don't, you have a very situated communities, and socio-situated work is often very supportive. I mean, the outside implies an inside. It's like subject implies an object. And there's like conscious implies a subconscious and an unconscious. So any of those dyads or triads are working on the same ground. But the outwith is what you don't know. So you're not working on the same grounds. And I mean, yes, my thought is really, really inflected by Taoist thinking. I mean, a Taoist would understand this in the sense of when a person becomes undifferentiated, when one of the examples is the carpenter. There's a certain kind of carpenter who can see in that tree that there is a table that he can carve out of it, or they can carve out of it, right? But the Tao Te Ching implies that you don't need to do that, that if you become undifferentiated with the tree, then in a sense the table is already made. But then you have to gather yourself again, because you can't live undifferentiated with a tree without dying. And if you gather yourself together again and you've been part of a tree and a table and a chair and a whole bunch of other stuff, I don't know, you've been morphologically part of an ecology that is not the person. But you've gathered yourself into your person again, and you're different because you've been through the change of that ecology. It's just it's a set, it's an approach. You know, ideology is never going to go away. Sociocultural is never going to go away. Discourse is never going to go away. It may be different in different places at different times. What I think is really remarkable about the kind of effects of liberal ideology is that it kind of denies that anything else can exist apart from itself. And if that were true, then nothing would change. And things do change. So how do things change? So then you kind of think, well, you know, where does change come from? Change comes usually from small communities of dedicated people who are trying to figure out why nobody listens to them. And then they figure out a way of finding the thing that they find most important, which is what I would call a positionality. And then they figure out, well, nobody in discourse is going to understand us if we say that. So how do we set this positionality towards discourse so that it can understand what we're talking about? And so they enter discourse, but they never enter discourse with the full sense of the positionality, because they got to compromise. You know, politics is all about compromise. And some people are really interested in what happens when things go from positionalities to set towards to discourse. And that's a lot of people interested in performance studies are interested in that. And the people who are really interested in how does the set toward move into discourse are the cultural studies people. But what I'm interested in is the stuff that happens before that. Like, why do people get together in the first place to talk about stuff that nobody ever talks about? How do they do that? How do you form a politics of practice rather than a politics of representation? And I think art makers tend to do a lot of that work. There's so many art makers, they work and they work and they work for 10 or 15 years, and they either give up and they go get a job in a bank, or they continue on with a job in a bank, or they forget it. They actually have this amazing thing that everybody suddenly recognizes and wants to pay them money for so that they can eat. You know, the bottom line on this is, you know, if you're an art maker, how do you produce stuff in a neoliberal world where everything is commodified, that somebody will give you enough money to eat, but you need to maintain your somatic structure in some way or another. So at some point or another, artists often have to make a pragmatic decision. Do I replicate this thing that everybody seemed to think was wonderful and was willing to let me eat for? And then a lot of artists find themselves just churning out the same old thing for the next 5-10 years until everybody knows what it is, and it's no longer something that's giving any energy. I mean, it could be refound and refreshed, but that's a kind of, realpolitik of what happens in art a lot of the time. But how do you keep sustaining the energy to loose yourself? And it's difficult because some people talk about risk, right? They'll talk about artists taking risks, sometimes in the same vocabulary that I've just been using. But a risk is something that you weigh up. A risk is something that you usually calculate. And some people are more able to take risks than others for various reasons. They may be physically able to have a lot of money, and so they don't have to worry about eating. And I don't know that risk is really the right word here. I think need is the word that often comes up when I talk to art makers about why are they doing this thing that they don't get any recognition for, and nobody seems to understand what they're doing, and they've alienated a bunch of people, or they have a bunch of fans they don't like. Why are they doing this thing, this art making thing? And most of the people that I talk to just say, well, I kind of have to. It's something that if I don't do, I don't feel complete. I don't feel it's worth going on. So need seems to me to be a very important word in this whole discussion. A lot of my early thinking was drawn from the Situated Knowledges article by Donna Haraway. She's not really interested in quite the same things that I am. She's interested in sociosituated work. She's interested in positionalities. I've had this experience of working with people like you guys, who are making work that doesn't really make discursive sense a lot of the time. I'm absolutely fascinated by how that happens and why people do it. An easy answer used to be that, what artists were the kind of intellectual challengers of discourse. But that is predicated on the idea that discourse can recognize what you're doing. And an awful lot of art making isn't recognizable. How do you keep on going, producing stuff that isn't recognizable to anybody? But any material that you use, you need to approach it as unknowable.
I agree.
The moment you think you start to know it, the moment you think you start to know it, then you're colonizing it. I mean, that's a kind of cheap and easy way to get rid of it, but it's very, 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 very difficult to do because you can't completely not know it. Because when you gather yourself together again and you want to presence the change that has happened and the energy of that change, and you want to when you're presencing that change that has happened and you're represencing it in performativity, you're in a way what you are represencing is the knowable bit of the thing that you engaged with. But of course, it's not exactly that because it's going through you. But in a funny way, it like science, art engages with material through various different practices that allow the materiality of that material to make change and be represenced in different ways, depending upon what your practice is. Usually what an art maker does is they give it a form where it can be represenced again. Sometimes the forms lose their impact over time, but not always. And when a form is represencing that energy, that's what I call a medium. So when you think about the book, The Politics of Practice goes through concepts of rest, with a bracket, form, medium, just trying to figure out a way of, some art makers will repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. And it always seems to be alive. It always seems to have energy. Whereas others will repeat and repeat, and it kind of dies off really fast. Trying to sort of work out, how to sustain the energy of that is tricky. And it'll never be answered. It's just that I'm fascinated by it. I think a moment of rest is, in the way that I'm using it with that bracket in front of it, is something that we feel, not something that we necessarily know. It's something that we recognize as happening to ourselves when we are, the Taoists would say, we are differentiating back into selfhood. But you could also say you're gathering yourself back from whatever you were loosed into. What do? Do you go on gathering and gathering and gathering? No, you don't. There are often, in that process of gathering, there's a moment of rest. So, I mean, the way I describe it when it happens to me is it's just almost like my whole kind of somatic tangle recognizes a moment of rest. It doesn't have to go any further than this. This is the change. This is the thing. This is what's happened. And I can't usually at that stage articulate it. I don't think it's quite the same as felt sen, which Gendlin, talks about, but it might be. But for me, it's kind of like a somatic recognition of the change that has happened. I think that this state is, or maybe the state of morphing more, requires one to think of time and space in completely different terms. And most of us have had the experience of, when we're deep inside a practice, you don't notice time. You often operate within space in ways that you don't normally. Yeah. So, why does that happen?